in the past, so I want to make sure everything's going well beforehand.
Yep. Good idea.
We've even time zones have tripped us up in the past.
So have you been able to have your buildings open?
We're open 3 days a week, and then closed. We work from home for the other 2. So it's working. It's not ideal, but
yeah, we opened July 9th, 4 days a week from 10 to 4 with timed tickets and 25% of capacity.
Yeah, we kind of have an odd, because we're free, and then it's kind of hard to figure out like capacity and stuff for us, and so we just kind of keep an eye on it. And it's Matizzi. It's not like there's a rush of people, but we've had decent attendance over the last however long it's been.
Oh, good. Yeah, we've been doing pretty well. You know, we've certainly have had people thank us for being open.
Yeah. When did you guys close down? Was it like March?
Yeah, March 13th.
I think that's about the same for us.
Yeah. And had about a handful of people be able to go in on a daily basis because they had to be on campus. And then a bunch of us got in early June, a couple of days a week anyway.
Nice.
Yeah. Yep.
How has the response been to, like, what kind of measures do you have in place for visitors at the museum?
Well, we certainly have folk, most people come in, they've bought their tickets ahead of time. We have, we put up plexiglass at the ticket window and all of that. So we ask folks to wear masks, and they've been good about that. We've had either staff or volunteers in the galleries just making sure we don't get past capacity for any of the spaces. So far we haven't hit that. And just to answer some basic questions, but our crew goes through there on a very regular basis, I should say, to keep things clean.
Yeah.
We had to take a couple of things offline because they just involved too much contact.
Yeah, we took down all of our interactives. Yeah. Some of them I was able to replace with like a QR code where they do something online. Right. But
sounds like the restaurants where you sit outside now, and if you want the menu, you got to activate the QR code.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Wyoming restaurants are pretty much open. I don't know that there's.
Yeah. It seems like your state didn't get hit very hard.
No.
Plus, it's fairly open.
Yeah, there's a lot of space to social distance.
Yeah, I drove through once, 40 years ago, thereabouts, when I was a teenager. But we're on a trip across the country. We did some whitewater rafting in Idaho and Oregon, and drove through like the northeastern corner of the state. So I got to see a little bit of Wyoming anyway.
It all kind of looks the same. There are some parts that are very different, but for the most part. It's very similar.
So I watched the presentation that was done on elephants. That was interesting.
Yeah, wasn't that really? I was very, very interested by that the whole time. I was so many questions. It was cool.
I just got a text from my sister who's out there in Denver that they're getting ready to watch her husband has family in Wyoming.
Nice. I'm from Colorado, and that seems to be a
Yeah.
common theme.
Yeah, well, one's in Denver, one's in Longmont.
My grandparents lived in Longmont for a while.
Yeah. Nice town. I like it a lot.
Yeah, the cheese factory there is awesome.
Yeah. Haven't been there, but I've heard about it.
Very cool.
Yeah. And my dad is there too. He moved out. I'm glad I put my phone on silent. I've just gotten a couple of texts from people.
Yeah, I always forget, and then sometimes I'll get like a phone call in the middle of stuff, but I did it today.
Yeah. Actually, I should probably unplug the cord from my wife's work phone.
We've still got a couple minutes.
And you said that Alex is going to start stuff at 8 o'clock?
No, she started the
All right, so she's doing that part of it. Okay.
Yep, and then she'll monitor Facebook and get the questions to me, and then I'll ask you those at the end of the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, she does a lot of behind the scenes things.
Have to have those people.
She's always a good sport when I try to get her to do things for YouTube.
Oh, good. Well, thank you, Alex.
You're welcome.
So how big is your museum?
Well, I do have an overhead photo of it. It takes up a whole block.
Okay.
It started off as one building, which I'm actually going to point out on slide number 3, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then we take up the whole block now. So it's 7 buildings on one street, 2 buildings on another, and the alleyway that was in between all those buildings is also part of the campus. It was turned into a hallway to just connect everything.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And we've been there since 1906.
That's so cool.
Although the newest building is 5 years old.
Nice.
So it's 22 galleries, I think.
Oh, wow.
Some big, some small, some permanent exhibits, some that change once a year, some that change every 3 months. No.
Very cool.
It is cool. Yeah. As of 2 days ago, I've been there 16 years.
Well, congratulations on your
Thank
16th
you.
anniversary.
Never thought I'd be there that long.
Yeah, because you have a background in science.
Yes. So I like to tell people that I'm the science guy in a history museum. I'm there to tell the whales side of the story.
There you go. That's important.
Mm-hmm. And people ask. They definitely ask. Yeah. And for those of you that are wondering, it's just water.
All right. Well, I'll go ahead and start with the introduction. And then we can roll over to the really cool stuff. So thanks everybody for joining. This is part of the Meeteetse Museum's Human and Wildlife Interaction Series, which came out of, actually this guy behind me had a lot to do with it. We got a new grizzly, so he's our newest grizzly, Big Joe. And in updating our little wob side of the exhibit, there were just so many questions and so many human and wildlife interactions that have similarities to grizzlies and things like that, that we didn't have space to talk about. And so this is kind of a whole series that came out of wanting to talk more about things than we had the space to. And it's been really interesting. You can find, if you missed any of them, you can find them all on our Facebook page. Last week was paleontology. Next week will be bison. And we've had everything from tigers and elephants to the history of hunting and conservation. So it's been a really great series. And luckily we were able to do it through virtual programming. And so I'm really excited about today's presentation, which is about whaling, because it's such a big part of history in the United States. And it's just so interesting. So I will turn it over to Robert. I'm sorry, I was really confident in how to say your last name and I lost confidence.
Rocha.
Rocha, who's the Director of Education and Science Programs at the New Bedford Whaling Museum in New Bedford, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Amy. And hello, everyone, and good evening. And I guess I can get my screen up now and we'll be ready to go. There we go.
All right, there it is.
Okay. All right. And I'll move stuff off to the side there. Okay, so thanks everybody for joining in. I'll do my best to keep this to about 15 minutes, leaving time for questions at the end. And off we go. So on this first slide, you see the logo painted in 1903 for the Old Dartmouth Historical Society, which is the organization that founded the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And you even see in our logo that it points out how dangerous the whaling industry can be and was for a lot of people that went out in those boats, went down to the sea in ships to go hunt whales. Working on the water has always been a tough way to make a living, and whaling is certainly a good example of that. But before we get into this, I thought what I would do is try to connect where I am in the town next to New Bedford and what it connected to those of you out there in Wyoming. So here's this whaling captain, this guy in the circle, a guy named Peleg Gifford from the town of Fairhaven. In this strange photo are all these captains of this thing that happened during the Civil War called the Stone Fleet, where these men all agreed they would take their whale ships, sail them down to try to create a blockade in front of Savannah Harbor and Charleston Harbor, try to block the Confederate ships. Didn't really work well, but that guy Gifford factors into the story because he had a daughter named Abby, and Abby married this guy, Henry Huddleston Rogers. Henry was a very wealthy man, made a lot of money in petroleum oil as opposed to whale oil, and they had 5 children, and their 4th oldest was also their 4th daughter, Mary, who went by the nickname of May. She married a guy named William Robertson Coe. And they had 4 children. The 3rd one is Henry Huddleston Rogers Coe. And then that H.H. Rogers Coe got married and had a son named Hank Coe. And some of you will recognize him because he just retired as one of your federal representatives, I believe. I think Hank looks a little like his great-grandmother. And the other thing I'll point out here is that Henry, the great-grandfather, also built this church in Fairhaven. He built it in honor of his mother, and it's now a Unitarian Universalist church. My wife and I are members there, and the minister there now grew up in Wyoming. And to finish the Henry Huddleston Rogers story, because not only does he factor in my life on what I do on Sundays, he also factors into where I work. Because Henry bought this building you see with the arrow here. It was built as a bank in 1884. But by 1898, the bank part of it had gone out of business, and eventually Henry bought that building and donated it to the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. If you go back to slide 1, you'll remember the seal that you saw with the whale biting through the boat. So that building was the first building the ODHS ever owned. That became the first building for the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And now we take up the whole block. So the arrow points to the same building, but surrounded by a whole bunch of things that are a lot newer than 1884. And all of those buildings in that photo, this is along the east side of our campus, that's all the Whaling Museum, and that building closest to you with the whale fluke sculpture is part of our theater. So just to give you a sense of where we are, so that picture on the top left, that's taken just to the west of where I took the photo in the last slide. So that's our campus. You see the theater over on the left, and that's looking south. And then inside, so over here, we have a half scale. The top right photo is a half scale model of a whaling ship. So instead of being like 105 feet long, it's 57 feet long. On the lower left, you can see our lobby gallery where we have skeletons of a North Atlantic right whale, a blue whale, and a humpback whale. And that big pinkish blob down there, that's a life-size model of a blue whale heart, as if that heart was based on a 100-foot-long blue whale. Bottom middle, sperm whale skeleton, and bottom right is one of our cabinets of something called scrimshaw, which is artwork done on the hard parts of marine mammals, typically sperm whale teeth, but occasionally walrus tusk, baleen, and sometimes these artists and artisans would combine wood with the teeth. Most of the teeth were done on ships, and it was done while the guys had nothing to do because there were days when it was boring. And they, everybody needs a creative outlet, and for these guys, their options were limited. They had the chance to carve some teeth and make some scrimshaw. All right, so onto the whaling story. So whaling has been a global industry for 500-600 years, and a lot of it had to do with catching stuff off the shore. But in the Basque part of the world, which encompasses that little corner there in the Bay of Biscay with Spain and France, those folks have been whaling for about 1,000 years. And there's evidence of them over in Red Bay, Labrador from 800, 900 years ago. Even though the ships in this painting, which happens to be the oldest known oil painting in the world of a whaling scene, this is from 1602, I think, maybe 1620. The guys in the boats, all the crew, all the experienced crew were all Basques, even though these were Dutch-owned ships, but the crew members here were all Basques. So they had spent so much time on the water, they knew they were the best versed and best skilled at the work needed to catch and process whales. This shows you some more Dutch ships, and occasionally whales would wash up on the beach and people would make use of them. The British were also whaling, and they would typically go north to go get things like bowhead whales. And here's a good map or a good chart of what's going on up in the Arctic. Again, a lot of it came about because of the whale ships heading up that way to go hunt whales, and you always needed these things charted, otherwise you were quite likely to lose your ship. So in these two images here, these are a couple of images from Europe showing how people would make use of whales that stranded on the beach. Either they were close to shore and they get dragged in, and you see a couple of anchors there to pull them in, or they would just wash up on the beach. And even though you've got one scene on the left where the background is more ocean and the scene on the right where the background is the shoreline, you can see the work happening is pretty much the same. They've got hatchets, they have whatever sharp tools available to slice into the whales, to strip away the skin, which was usually stayed attached to the blubber, because you could take blubber in solid form and heat it up and turn it into liquid oil, and you can use that for a variety of purposes, which I will show you later. Some might even eat the meat. we know very few people eat sperm whales that taste so bad. Well, at least you've got, so you got these two images here showing, again, stranded whales. And here in the colonies in the 1600s and 1700s, you were happy to have a whale wash ashore because there was a source of whale oil, there was a source of meat. The baleen could be used for a variety of products. Of course, one of the things that these images could not possibly indicate is what it smelled like. Because I've cleaned a whale before, and rotting whale just doesn't smell very good. You see a little bit of work going on in these two pots right here in the bottom right, taking the blubber in chunks, putting it into these big cast iron pots called tripots to heat up the blubber to turn it into liquid oil. And you notice in both these images too, there's always a sharpening stone on hand, because you got to keep the tool sharp. Because even though it's blubber and you would think it'd be fatty and easy to cut, there is connective tissue in there, so you need to have your tools sharp. Plus, you want to speed up the work, because the longer it takes, the more likely it is some of this stuff might go rancid. So work fast and maximize your yield. Sounds like work today, doesn't it? Okay, so setting the stage there. What I figured I would do here is give you a sense of where I am now and where this industry was based out of. So, see Massachusetts, you can see us in relation to the Atlantic Ocean. And then in the black and white photo in the bottom right, I've put an arrow pointing out basically where the Whaling Museum is. And the Whaling Museum is literally just up the hill from where most of the ships would sail. So they would sail southwest into Buzzards Bay. So that bay there that kind of looks like, like the mouth of an alligator or a Pac-Man, that's Buzzards Bay, and that connects directly to the Atlantic Ocean. And as point of reference as well, if you go to the right, you've got the arm of Cape Cod. And if you go straight south from the elbow of Cape Cod, that crescent-shaped island, that's the island of Nantucket. That's the Quakers that were there they had really moved the whaling industry along. And then they were encouraged in the mid to late 1700s to start moving their operations to New Bedford for a variety of reasons, one of which included you were slowly having to go further away to catch whales. You needed bigger ships. The ships were getting too big for the harbor. So go to New Bedford, deeper harbor, easier access to raw materials and to markets. Because remember, you get the product, you have to be able to sell it. Okay. So just down the hill from the museum is Center Street. So there's a nice painting here from the early 1700s when whaling was getting started. I should say mid 1700s, early days of whaling. In that bottom photo, whaling ended in New Bedford in 1925, and there weren't many ships left by 1910. And you can see a couple down there at the bottom of Center Street. And if you were at the Whaling Museum now, you could look out one of the galleries and still would be looking down that street. And some of those buildings are still there. Okay. So this image here from 1763, again, the early days of the whaling industry. And you can see in the bottom right, those two pots with those lumpy bits. Those are chunks of whale blubber, which are then going to get put into the try-works, which is that structure with the roof on it with the central chimney. And you can see you got that one-masted sloop there. And this guy that I just highlighted in the circle or in the oval is a guy named Joseph Russell III. He was the one that encouraged the Quakers to start coming over from Nantucket to start, to get the whaling industry going in New Bedford. And the artist, William Allen Wall, made this comment in 1853 when he painted this. Remember, William Allen Wall was not alive in 1763, but he had a pretty good imagination. So he said, seated upon the frame of a grindstone is seen in his broad-brimmed hat and friendly coat, and friendly with a capital F, because he was a Quaker, Society of Friends, the founder of New Bedford and the father of her whale fishery, Joseph Russell. So included in this painting, you have a Native American trader, most likely a Wampanoag, a Black Hostler, laborers, oxen, the try house with the sperm wheel jaw on the roof, and most importantly, a sloop careened on the shore flying a red ensign of the British Merchant Service. So this was early on in the whaling industry in New Bedford, but by then, while the whaling industry from Nantucket had already been sailing out and coming back with blubber to bring to shore. It was right about this time too that the Try works, TRY works, in which you would heat up the blubber to turn it into oil, were actually put onto the whale ships. You might be asking yourself, well, how the heck do you put a fire on a wooden ship without burning the ship? Well, they lined these try works with brick, a couple layers of brick with a layer of water in between, brick all around the try pots, and then chimneys to send the smoke up. And in nearly every case, the ships went out, did their processing at sea, and brought things back and didn't burn. All right, so now it's time to go on a whaling voyage. Let's sail ourselves out of the city, heading southeast out of New Bedford, past Clark's Point Light. In later years, there would be a Civil War fort built there, and it's still there and getting repaired so it can be a tourist attraction again. There's a nice park out there now too. You're going to see this lighthouse image later for a different reason. There's a couple of the typical three-masted whaling ships that would head out. And you notice in both of those, you can see these black squares painted along that stripe of white. Those are fake cannon ports. So from a distance, if you were to see these ships, you might think, those things have cannons. I'm not going to mess with them. Whale ships never had cannons. They hardly ever had much beyond, there were a couple of pistols, but they typically had plenty of knives and blades for cutting the whale, but they certainly didn't have cannons. And typical ship was somewhere just over 100 feet long, and that main mast, the one in the middle, would be 100 feet tall. And you'll notice on top of the main mast would be the house flag, the flag of whoever owned the ship, whoever the lead agent was. So heading east, southeast into the Atlantic to go catch whales. Well, here they are having a good day where they've got the sails furled up, the boats lowered. Most of the crew, except for 3 or 4 people, the cooper, the carpenter, and the cook, who always stayed on the ship. Everybody else was out there in the boats trying to catch whatever whales were available. Now, if they only saw one whale, they wouldn't necessarily lower all the boats, but you would certainly, again, want to maximize your opportunity to get the whale, because the way people were paid was based on what you caught. It was called the lay system. So you were promised a percentage of the profits at the end of the voyage. So the more you caught, the more you made. You weren't just guaranteed X amount of dollars, you were guaranteed based on whatever you caught. So you were eager to get out there and catch as much as possible so that way you can get paid. Some of those voyages didn't go so well. Some guys came back actually owing money because occasionally they would have to buy something from the captain's slop chest, as they called it, where there was pants, socks, tobacco. And if you didn't make enough money, you actually end up having to go out on another voyage to pay off your debts. Okay. And I had mentioned earlier that there were days when there was nothing to do because there were no whales around. You notice the title of this painting, it says, having a gam, no whales in sight. A gam would be a meeting of 2 ships in the ocean where they would drop anchor, lower at least one boat and row over to a different boat. So the captains could talk, maybe a couple of crew members could talk. And if there happened to be wives on board, then they would try to, let the ladies meet and chat as well. All right, so let's go through a couple of factoids here that I think will help set the stage. So New Bedford was the center of the global whaling industry in the 1800s. It became the #1 port starting in basically 1827. In 1857, as you can see, there were 329 ships registered. That was the peak. After that, the numbers would begin to drop. And these voyages would literally go, out of the city, across the equator, into the South Atlantic, around Cape Horn, into the Pacific, and then chasing whales that way. They, meet people at a variety of Pacific islands, including the Sandwich Islands, which we now call Hawaii. Although occasionally when they sailed south, instead of going around South America, they might head towards the Indian Ocean and go around Cape of Good Hope in Africa, at the tip of Africa. But the way the Gulf Stream worked, it typically would, you'd leave Buzzards Bay, get into the Atlantic, and end up in the Azores Islands. The Azores Islands are a chain of 9 islands, about 2/3 of the way between here and Portugal. And if you're wondering where the name Rocha comes from, it comes from the Azores. All of my dad's grandparents were from one of the Azores Islands, even though the family name was Da Rocha at the time. They came over to work in the mills. They didn't come over for whaling. But the Portuguese had colonized the Azores in the 1500s. The Cape Verde Islands, which are off the coast of West Africa, off the country of Senegal, the Portuguese had colonized those in the 1400s. And the Gulf Stream would bring you from the Azores down to Cape Verde. And there were typically always men, often young men, willing to get off the islands, especially at times when there was drought, economy was tough, figured they had a better chance of making money on a whale ship than they would staying on the islands. And if you weren't the oldest son and you weren't going to get the farm, jump off. So, again, they'd sail around, and it brought New Bedford to other parts of the world. And then some of those folks came back to New Bedford. Any of you that have read Moby Dick, if you read chapter 6, that chapter talks about all the people you might see on the streets of New Bedford in the 1840s and 1850s. And you can see evidence of these connections. Now, I belong to a group called the Azorean Maritime Heritage Society. We actually own Azorean whaleboats, and we row those and sail those. All right, so what were they hunting? In the Atlantic Ocean, they were going after a couple of toothed whales, the pilot whale and the sperm whale, a couple of baleen whales, the North Atlantic right whale and the humpback whale. Although pilot whales weren't a major target, if they were available, they'd get them. They wanted the sperm whale because that's where you made most of your money. Explain that in a minute. In the Pacific Ocean, 3 of the same species, even though it was the North Pacific right whale. And then the gray whale is only a Pacific species, so you'd go after those animals. Once they get up into the Arctic, they were going after the cousin of the right whales, the bowhead, another one of these whales with a very arched upper jaw and very tall baleen, and about 60 feet long, and just huge blubbery animals. Had no problem living day to day in the Arctic Ocean. And just for fun, here's what they eat. On the left, you see a copepod. If any of you have kids or grandkids that watch SpongeBob SquarePants, you'll recognize something called Sheldon J. Plankton. The way Sheldon is drawn is based on that animal, although Sheldon doesn't have egg sacs on his hips. And then that shrimp-looking thing is krill, which tends to be the favorite food of blue whales. By the way, Yankee whalers couldn't catch blue whales, fin whales, and other species. They were just too fast to catch with a rowboat. All right, so how are you going to cut up these animals? Here's a diagram here from 1874. So you do this in the proper order. You strip off the blubber as the whale's rolling around in the water, kind of like peeling an apple or an orange. And those blubber strips would get cut down in smaller pieces, heated up in the tripods, and you get your oil and the tall stuff in the mouth, the baleen. That's flexible, made of the same stuff as our fingernails, toenails, and hair. Before we invented plastic, that was what we would use for flexible products. So some of the things we would use from the baleen, and there's the cutaway diagram there. These little strips of baleen that would go into corsets. We have this thing is called a busk. And some corsets had a big wide sleeve on top of the sternum. and you could put either a baleen busk or a whalebone busk, a whale literally bone, thin bone, over that. Oftentimes they would have romantic images because it was close to your lady's heart. But of course, just think about having to wear a corset and then having that big stiff thing over your sternum, how hard it must be to sit. You'd have to sit up very stiff and straight. They would make umbrella and parasol frames out of baleen, even make snow goggles, whips. That phrase, "I'm going to wail on you," apparently the origin is getting hit with a whip made out of whale baleen. And now the only product you can make from whales, because of the Marine Mammal Protection Act being passed in 1972, the Inupiat folks who still hunt bowheads in the Arctic for subsistence purposes, they can sell the baleen as artwork. It's almost like scratch art. You scratch away the surface and you're left with these nice images underneath. And also from the blubber part of those from whales. So you can see a jar of oil there on the left. You can see different kinds of whale oil lamps. That big lumpy thing is a big block of soap made out of whale oil. And you can see how oily that looks, but it was more about washing clothing with it than it was about washing your body with it. I can't imagine doing that. Some of the oil could actually be used for making rope and cord. Here's the old New Bedford Cordage Company. You see there's very, very long buildings for making rope. And also use some of that oil for tempering of steel and for the making of screws and bolts. Not done like that anymore, of course, but it certainly was back then. Then you have the sperm whale, where most of the whaling industry made its money because of those two things sitting on top of the skull, the case, and the junk. So in the case was a liquid oil, a waxy liquid oil known as spermaceti, hence the name sperm whale. And then the junk has that oil in it too, but it has a variety of connective tissue cells going vertically. So the whaleman could still get at the oil, but there was all this junk in the way to be able to get at it. And then they would often take the bottom jaws off because they wanted the teeth to do the scrimshaw, but also the fatty tissue in the hollow part of the jaw could be used for product as well. So let's take a look at some of that stuff. So the candles made from squeezing the oil out of the spermaceti would eventually leave you with wax, and would leave you with really, really nice, expensive candles that burn cleanly, no drip, no smoke. It was much more pleasant to have in your house than having an animal fat candle, certainly in terms of smell. And the term for candle power came about as to the brightness of a certain size sperm whale candle and how many lumens it gave off. I don't remember the exact numbers of that, but that's easy enough to look up. Sewing machine oil, bicycle oil, gun oil, lamp oil. And again, this spermaceti, the oil from the spermaceti, burns a little differently than the oil from the blubber, because toothed whales have waxy esters in their blubber and baleen whales don't. And I mentioned that Clark Point Lighthouse earlier. Lighthouses around the world were lit with sperm whale oil, the oil from the blubber. So as people were navigating the way around the world, you want to be able to see where you were going around the hazards of the ocean and the coastline. The Quakers cornered the market on this stuff, and they were, so they made a lot of money selling this stuff around the world. They even convinced people in London in the 1800s to light their street lamps with sperm whale oil to cut down on crime, and it worked. And lastly, that word ambergris, it's this lumpy stuff created by their intestines to deal with the irritation of squid beaks. Sperm whales eat a lot of squid, like a ton of it a day, literally. And somebody figured out you could take an alcohol called ambrin, extract it out of the ambergris, and I've heard that word pronounced three different ways: ambergris, ambergris, and ambergris, and put it into perfume, like this perfume here, and its fixative properties help to keep the color and the smell in the perfume for a much longer amount of time. Now, I don't know if everybody knew that when they were slapping this stuff on their bodies, where some of it came from. But as I tell people, it's kind of like hot dogs. Just don't ask. So what was it like chasing whales? I know this is the part you're all really interested in. What's it like to get out there in a boat, chase whales, and then what happens when it doesn't go so well for the whalers? So you can see them chasing sperm whales on the left, and it looks like a right whale on the right. And you notice they have to get really close to these animals. So, you have to lower the boats from the ships to go chase the whales. And every Yankee whaleboat had 5 guys rowing and a helmsman. Remember, any of you that have been in a rowboat, you can't see where you're going, because if you're trying to put as much force into your strokes as possible, you got to be able to put your back into it. So the helmsman would bark out the orders, and the guys rowing would have to trust him to get them where they needed to be, and also not get them where they didn't want to be. And these boats were made out of oak and cedar. Okay. Just to give you a better sense of what one of these boats looks like, you can see on the left, that's a whaleboat that came off the last ship to bring oil into New Bedford in 1925. So that boat's 30 feet long. And again, you'd have 5 guys seated, 1 guy standing, and that big post in the back is what you would wrap the line around after you had tossed the harpoon and it was fastened into the whale. And the line would go around that post called a loggerhead a couple of times. It would help you control the boat as you were getting pulled along. But somebody was always pouring water onto that loggerhead so the friction didn't catch the boat on fire. And you can see the black and white photo, the process of literally lowering these boats from the davits. When you get the boat in the water, you would lift the hook off the loop at the back of the boat and then either put up a sail to sail away or start rowing. And if you got yourself fastened to a whale, this is what happened. The Nantucket sleigh ride. And, the whale would you were hoping the whale would not dive straight down, because if you ran out of line, you'd have to do what that guy in the front of the boat's ready to do, and that's take the hatchet and cut the line. You'd hope that the whale would start swimming and pulling along 2,000 pounds plus of boat, men, and gear, and eventually tire itself out. So the harpoon didn't kill the whale. Tiring out the whale so you can get close with a lance and stab it with a lance, that's what killed the whale. However, it didn't always go so well. So whales are exceptionally strong animals, and there's a lot of muscle in their back end because, unlike a sea turtle, which I like to call front wheel drive, their flippers pull them through the water. Whales are rear wheel drive. Their back ends are pushing them through the water, and their flukes, which are horizontal, just press up and down against the water. And if you've ever watched, I think it's Pacific Mutual and Northwest Mutual, those commercials where you see humpbacks leaping out of the water, it's the back end that is pushed all 30, 40, 50,000 pounds or more out of the water. So if that tail can push the entire whale out of the water, it has no problem flipping a 2,000 pound boat. And as you can see in these 2 paintings here, on the sketch and the painting, and also carved onto that sperm whale tooth, on the left side of it, you see a boat airborne with men falling out of it. And I remember when I first started to learn about this, when I was, began my days at the Whaling Museum, found out that a lot of these guys couldn't swim. A lot of guys came from inland with this promise of adventure and, this romantic pursuit of whales. It was all a con job, of course, because it's as I said, a dirty way to make a living. So a lot of these guys were out there and they couldn't swim. And some, I've read, decided they didn't want to learn. They figured, if I'm in the water, I don't want to get eaten by sharks. I might as well just drown and get it over with. But if you were lucky, if you got tossed from your boat, you'd land near your boat and be able to grab an oar, grab the boat, grab a couple of planks and float around until another boat came and got you. Another example of and I just circled that phrase there, stove boat. A stove boat means a boat that has been stove in by a whale. In other words, it's been either rammed by the front of the whale or flipped by the back of the whale, but the boat's been knocked in and not usable anymore. So you can see from these, and I didn't point out that almost every image that I'm showing you tonight comes from our collections. And if you're curious about, what we have online, if you go to our webpage and go to the Explore page, you'll be able to see these images. So you got perils of the Pacific whale trade. And again, you get people being tossed around. And I love the fact that this painting on the right, you can see these guys that, that are rowing. They can't quite see what's going on, but the guy who's about ready to toss the harpoon, to dart the iron, as the phrase goes, he sees what's happening to the boat in front of him. Okay. Top left, not only do they have to deal with the fact that their boat's been flipped, but now there are sharks circling because they smell the blood in the water. You can see some other images here of the whales getting the better of the boats and of the whalemen. The bottom right, it says sperm whale in a flurry. That phrase is an indication that the whale is close to being killed. It's been stabbed several times with the lance, and it's starting to go into its final agonizing tossing and turning and flailing about, and will soon be done with. Probably the worst thing for these guys, though, was when the sperm whales would roll over onto their backs and literally bite through the boats. You think about the fact that each of those teeth probably weighs 2, 3, 4 pounds, and there's 44, 46 of them. You add all that weight up and the weight of the lower jaw, and for the whale to be able to open and close that mouth while swimming through the water and fighting through that kind of drag, you're going to have no problem biting through a boat like that. And, in every case, the whale's getting the better of the guys in the boat. So let's talk about some specific examples. So let's start with Captain Edmund Gardner. So 23-year-old captain out on a ship called the Union, sails out of Nantucket Harbor, I believe, heading towards the Azores. And one night, apparently it was an accident, a sperm whale rammed into his ship and caused enough of a hole that he had to get all his crew off the ship, into the boats, and start rowing towards the Azores. And they eventually made it. Nobody died. They were rescued and brought back home. Well, a few years go by. He's captain of another ship, the Winslow, off the coast of Peru. And he's in a boat, and they've harpooned a whale, and he's trying to set another harpoon into it. And as he's about to do this, the whale does that where it rolls over and bites through the boat and actually bit into him, knocked him back. And to summarize, he ended up with a dent in his head for the rest of his life, injuries to his shoulder, to both hands. He was carried on a litter of some sort through into Peru to this doctor he had heard of. And, Gardner was in so much pain, he wanted his hand cut off. And the guy said, no, I can take a bone out to relieve the pain. Your hand will be crippled, but you still have a hand. And that's how Gardner lived the rest of his life. In 1851, the Anne Alexander, they were out whaling, and they were sunk by an injured sperm whale that actually rammed the ship. And they were rescued. And so all the crew lived, and they were rescued a couple of days later by another ship. And about 5 months after that, that same whale that had sunk the Anne Alexander, which had the injuries and had pieces of wood in it and had other identifying marks from weapons that were still, hunting tools that were stuck in this whale, it was caught by another ship. And they were able to say, yes, this was the whale that rammed the Anne Alexander in 1851. And the Kathleen was a ship that sailed out of the city. And there's a picture of it in 1902. This happened a couple of years after that. This whale rammed toward the back of, even though it says in the front here, supposedly, according to the captain, was hit near the mizzenmast, which is towards the stern of the ship, and then not only hit the ship, but then as it tried to surface, came up under the ship and lifted the ship up out of the water a little bit. That crew had to abandon ship, get in the boats, and they were rescued the next day. Now on to the most famous example of a whale sinking a ship. In 1820, the ship that had sailed out of Nantucket, called the Essex, was in the Pacific Ocean hunting a whale. And if you've seen the movie In the Heart of the Sea, you'll know the story, or if you've read the book, there's a teenage version of the book called Revenge of the Whale. So this whale rammed this, supposedly the whale was as big as the ship. The ship was 85 feet long. The folks on the ship said the whale was the same size as the ship. It rammed it twice and sank the ship. And you see this, the various images here of this whale charging the ship and sinking it. So they managed to get everybody off the ship into the boats, and they decided they were going to try to head towards South America rather than to Pacific Islands, because they thought the islands were going to be inhabited by cannibals and they didn't want to meet their end that way. So eventually, after 89 days, some of the crew was rescued in one boat, and then other crew were rescued 4 days after that. So here's the crew of the Essex. Let's start with the guy whose name is in blue, Henry DeWitt. Henry, when the ship was anchored off the coast of Ecuador, Henry decided not to get back on the ship. Smartest move he ever made. Everybody else is back on the ship. The guys in the rusty color font, Thomas Chappell, Seth Weeks, William Wright, decided to stay on Henderson Island when all the three boats with these men got onto the island. And after they blew through all the possible food that was there, or just about all of it, the rest of the guys decided, no, well, we better start to row and go find help. Those three guys stayed and were later rescued. The guys in red, they died while paddling, trying to get themselves rescued. The guys in gray, and remember I said they made a decision to go in a certain direction to avoid being eaten by cannibals. Well, the guys in gray, after they died, or a couple of them were offed by their crew members because they drew the shortest straw. After they were killed, they were eaten by the other guys in their boat, because that's what these guys had they'd gone through all their water, all their food. And the men who lived, the guys who were in black font, had to resort to cannibalizing their crew members. The strangest part of this story is that Owen Coffin, the first name listed under sailors, was the nephew of Captain George C. Pollard. I don't know how you explain to your family that you had to eat your own nephew. Well, a couple of years later, most of these guys were back out whaling again. Pollard went out on another ship, and that one, called the Two Brothers, ended up wrecking off the northwest Hawaiian Islands. And after that, no one would sail with him anymore. He ended up becoming the lighthouse keeper on the island of Nantucket. And much of the script for the movies comes from Owen Chase's book that he wrote in like 1823, I think, 1822. And then Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy, who as an adult wrote his story down. You take those and some other accounts, and author Nathaniel Philbrick did some other research as well and created the book In the Heart of the Sea, which later became the movie. And with that, of the most famous of those negative human whale interactions, negative for the people, of course, and a lot of times for the whale, I will end it there. And I'm ready, willing, and able to take questions if you have any.
We have got a lot of questions.
Okay.
So first off, the sperm whale produced spermaceti, sperm oil, etc. And you talked about it briefly, but can you describe differences between them and how they were refined?
Sure.
And their coloring.
Okay. So sperm oil was taken from the blubber of the sperm whale, and that was typically like the finest grade of it would have been called brown and handsome. So it was like a light brown color. And that's when you were able to get the whale cut up quickly. And as it was being heated in the tripots were at the proper temperature, so you didn't scald the oil, and you're able to get it into the casks and sealed up so that you had the highest grade sperm oil that you could. The spermaceti, if the whale was under a certain size, you could actually cut the case and the junk off of the whale and bring it on board the ship, cut a hole in the case and scoop the oil out. So if it was warm enough, it was, the oil would be liquid, and you would store that separately. I know some of the folks that are on this have watched the show, Dirtiest Jobs. Well, sometimes, especially if the whale was big enough and you couldn't cut the case and the junk off the whale and the whale stayed in the water, and the whale was brought up alongside the starboard side of the ship, someone might have to go inside the case to scoop the oil out, get as much of it out. Again, every last bit of this was making money for you, so you wanted to get every last bit of product that you could. And that would be more of a clear color or a yellow color. And they had really big presses and you put this sperm oil, the spermaceti, in these canvas bags, and or in things of burlap, and you would do a winter press, a summer press, a spring press, and squeeze out the oil. And the winter press was always the best possible oil, the one where you would make the most money possible. Then the other two, but then eventually you'd have the wax left over and you would make candles from that. So I hope that answers the question. If not, I try to provide a little more detail.
That's good. Did the whale oil lamps let off a smell, or were they relatively smellless?
The whale oil, if it was just blubber oil from a baleen whale, you'd be able to smell it. It was the sperm whale oil, the spermaceti oil, that didn't have a smell. Same with the spermaceti candles. Now, I've never smelled a whale candle. I couldn't tell you what it smells like, but certainly spermaceti candles and spermaceti oil in a lamp didn't have a smell, whereas whale, blubber oil would.
And how expensive for the average person was the sperm whale wax compared to that of other animals?
I wish I had a great answer for that question. Those numbers I don't know, and I know we can find that on the website. And sometimes there are folks on the internet that have delved into the economics of spermaceti candles versus tallow candles. I'm guessing it's like 8 to 10 to 12 times more, though, for a spermaceti candle.
Mm-hmm. Did the cheapness of petroleum contribute at all to the end of the whaling?
It did. It was one of several factors that led to the demise of the whaling industry. It was a combination of the gold rush taking some young men away who would have otherwise gone out on whale ships. You had the Civil War, and Confederate raiding ships were sinking whaling ships. You had, and that's, 1861 through 65, you had the discovery of oil in Pennsylvania, and certainly that was, it's easier to dig, to drill a well inland than it is to outfit a ship and send it around the world. There was an Arctic disaster in 1871 where 32 out of 36 ships that were in the Bering Sea got crushed by ice that came in a lot in September when nobody was expecting it. So you had 32 ships. That's a lot of capital, both physical and in investment. All of that, was going to be just about impossible to replace, and it wasn't. And there was another Arctic disaster in 1876. There was a whole host of factors. And then you get into it a little later on in the early 1900s when the whale oil market was really low. There was still whaling going on to catch baleen, but then corsets went out of fashion, and then spring steel was invented. So you didn't need baleen plates for leaf springs for carriages anymore. So all those things, spelled the end of the whaling, at least the Yankee whaling industry. The industrial whaling industry, which was all factory ships and catcher boats, was something completely different.
You mentioned the Civil War, and did whaling pause during the Civil War since the crew would have been the same age as like soldiers, or did it continue?
A lot of it was curtailed because of Confederate ships sinking whaleboats, because whale ships were catching whales and providing oil to the North for a variety of things. And, that was one, was a Confederate way of cutting off a supply line. But some ships did manage to get themselves to the Pacific Ocean. They're a little more successful there. And by then, there had been a couple of ports or whaling stations set up in San Francisco. So some whaling was still going on in the Pacific Ocean.
How many men were needed to crew a ship?
Anywhere from 30, 35. Because if you had all 5 boats in the water at once, that's 5 times 6, so that's 30. Then you need at least another 3 or 4 to be on the ship. And if you get someone who gets hurt, it's good to have a reserve team.
And did Moby Dick and other books that came out about the whaling industry create interest in being on the whaling crew, or?
That's an interesting, I don't know. I know even by 1850, it was slowly getting harder and harder to get Yankees, at least, to get on whale ships. There was much more of a reliance on Azorians, Cape Verdeans, folks from other places to get on these ships to do the work. Even though if you look at a whale crew list from any time in the 1800s, it looks like, representation from the United Nations. But I should add too that Moby Dick, when it came out, was not really a successful book. It took a long time for people to grasp the depth of that book. It really wasn't until the 1920s. That book actually almost ended Melville's writing career.
And then another Moby Dick related question: how realistic was the book, and what is the Moby Dick Marathon?
So the book itself is quite realistic, because Herman Melville sailed out of New Bedford Harbor from the port of Fairhaven, so on the other side from New Bedford. He sailed out January 3rd, 1841, and spent 15 months on a whale ship. So a lot of what he wrote about, he saw firsthand. Even his time in New Bedford, which takes up chapters 1 through 9, 1 through 10, he got to see some of that on his own. So his descriptions of whale hunting, whale processing, and interactions between people, that's firsthand knowledge. But he also did a lot of reading from other whaling stories. He also met Owen Chase's son, and he read Owen Chase's book, so he knew about what happened to the Essex. So the chasing of the whale and the hunting of the whale and the ramming of the ship and all of that, that's clearly inspired by what happened to the Essex. And if you read that book a couple of times, you notice there's a lot of politics in that book too. It's Melville making a lot of statements about who are the true savages, who are the true civilized people, and there's still a lot of relevance now to resource extraction, that kind of oil then and oil extraction now.
Did whaling crew members have to know how to swim to be on a crew?
Not at all. And I think I did mention earlier, a lot of them didn't. As a matter of fact, ship owners, you really didn't even need to know how to harpoon or lance a whale or even know how to sail to be on a crew. If you were one of the green hands, one of the new guys, all you needed to do was to be willing to work hard, learn while you were out there, and be crazy enough to get in a 30-foot boat and go after a 50 or a 60-foot whale. Because there were already people, first mate, second mate, third mate, all those guys who knew how to do the so-called skilled work, and they know how to bark out the orders, because, the captain would give, the master of the ship would give the orders to the first mate, who would then direct other people to do, whatever the captain wanted. So when Melville got on, he got on as a grain hand.
How common were amputations and other injuries for whalers?
They were common. There was deaths every voyage, and as careful as the men were with coiling the line, so there were no knots, no twists. Sometimes things happen so fast, especially if you were in the boat, you're getting pulled along by a whale, and then you're able to get yourself in close to the whale as you're bringing the line back in. Maybe the whale changes its mind and starts swimming ahead again, and now you've got this line in the boat that's not perfectly coiled back up in the tubs. They could very well grab a hand, grab an ankle, and pull off a limb, or just pull the guy right out of the boat.
Are there confirmed cases of whalemen actually being eaten by sperm whales?
I know I've actually read a fair amount on this topic, and there have been stories written, not confirmed, that men have ended up in the mouths and getting swallowed by sperm whales. The only whale that could possibly swallow a human is a sperm whale. I mean, even something like a blue whale, whose mouth is big enough to hold a classroom with the kids, has a throat opening that's the size of a basketball. So no one's going to fit through there. But sperm whales eat squid that are the size of people, and a human could fit down the throat. Whether anybody was actually swallowed is still up for debate. There have been written stories about it, but there always seems to be some dispute. And if you get swallowed by a whale, you're not going to live through it, because you're going to suffocate. And we all know what stomach acid does to bodies.
So were whales overhunted similarly? Were whales overhunted to endangerment similarly to bison?
Great way to relate what's on the water to what happened out there. We know that gray whales were hunted to really low numbers. The whalers in the Pacific would certainly target gray whales when they were in Scammon Bay and Sea of Cortez in California, off the coast of California, Mexico, and get both calves and moms. And those numbers dropped precipitously. They were able to recover for a while. And then in the industrial whaling era, they were hunted down again. The good news part of that story is that gray whales came off the endangered species list, I think, in 1994. North Atlantic right whales, they were hunted down pretty badly, to the point where it was estimated that by 1935, there was maybe only 100 left. Their numbers are up, but they're on the critically endangered list again. And I'm trying to be as specific I can to the Yankee whaling industry, not to industrial whaling. That's a whole other topic, and I actually had a paper published about that in 2014, and that could be a topic of a whole other PowerPoint. And if anybody's interested in that paper, it's called Emptying the Oceans, a Summary of Industrial Whaling Catches in the 20th Century. Yankee whaling, over the course of, say, 150 years, was eclipsed pretty quickly by industrial whaling. So other than North Atlantic right whales and gray whales, and actually bowhead whales, the Yankee whaling did a number on those three species, but the others have managed. And I'm going to add in North Pacific right whale as well, because that industry was boom and bust in about 40 years time, between like 1840s and 1880s. Then those whales became hard to find. Plus the Pacific Ocean's bigger than the Atlantic Ocean.
And you touched on this, but we'll ask it just again.
Sure.
Which whales were added to the endangered species list, and have their numbers rebounded?
So as far as I recall, of the if we're just going to, so there's 14 species of baleen whale, and I think the only ones not on there are, and I'm talking just as the result of both Yankee whaling and industrial whaling. Minke whales are not on the endangered species list. Pygmy right whale is listed as data deficient, but North Atlantic, North Pacific right whale are endangered. Blue whales are still listed as endangered. Fin whales, I believe Say and Bruder's whales as well. Gray whales are not. 10 of the 14 populations of humpbacks are not listed as endangered, but 4 are. And I think I've got them all. And then in terms of toothed whales, sperm whales, I think are still listed as endangered, maybe threatened. The vaquita, which is a porpoise, is almost extinct. There might be 20 of them left. And there's a couple of others that have really low numbers, like the Maui dolphin, Hector's dolphin, and a couple of others. But there's like 90 recognized species of whale, dolphin, and porpoise.
Was there a recognition of, or I guess not a recognition, but a requirement of size for them to like go after it because it wouldn't be worth it otherwise?
For the Yankee whalemen, no, they hunted whatever was available. I mean, because they would take calves. There's like with sperm whales, if you found a pod of sperm whales, it was typically calves, moms, and other juveniles. Occasionally there'd be bulls around. So you would, if you got a calf, you took a calf, and oftentimes you take the calf, the mom would come back to try to protect the calf, and now you get access to mom. That was certainly the case with gray whales. In the industrial whaling era, there was, after the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling in the late 1940s, there were efforts to try to put minimum size regulations, but some countries thumb their nose at that. But in terms of the Yankee whaling industry, no, there were no minimum size regulations.
And then you mentioned the perfume. Did that occur at the same time as beaver musk was being used for perfume, or was it before or after, or do you know?
There's probably someone listening that can answer that better. I don't know enough about beaver musk. I'm guessing they were parallel because there was certainly trapping going on while whale hunting was going on, and a lot of the trapping was for furs. But I'm guessing folks even then knew, to take the musk glands from beaver and use that in perfume. Yeah, people have been using ambergris from whales for centuries. I think it was either King George or King Edward. Like one of his favorite meals was scrambled eggs and shaved ambergris. People have been burning it as incense for a couple of thousand years. I'm not sure when it became a part of perfume though. I haven't been able to find that yet. Find out who it was that figured out, was playing around doing some chemistry and found you could separate this one compound out of this lump of intestinal secretion from a sperm whale and use it in perfume.
That's an enterprising person.
Yes.
How heavy were the ships?
Well, typical ship, they're probably like 350, 385 tons. One of the slides that I showed was one of the larger ones. I think that was like 450 tons. That was probably like a 130-foot ship, but it's like 385 tons, I think.
Could the Industrial Revolution have occurred without the products that came out of whaling?
Boy, there's a topic for a whole other PowerPoint presentation. I don't know. I don't know that I'm qualified to answer that. I do know that the Industrial Revolution was going to happen anyway, but having lubricants from whale oil certainly helped.
And then how does your museum handle anti-whaling advocates such as Greenpeace?
Well, the Whaling Museum does not celebrate the whaling industry. We certainly acknowledge it. We tell the stories. We put it in context of the people and cultures that did the whaling. And with the exhibits we have now, we're, our voice is more for advocacy for conservation, for hearing the whales side of the story. We've got this educational partnership agreement with the U.S. Navy, which has been funding bioacoustics research since the late 1940s. And we display some of the tools they and others like Woods Hole Oceanographic have created to study the ocean, to study sound movement in the ocean. We, can't say we have a whole lot of contact with anti-whaling voices because we're not pushing for whaling to happen. If anything, we're saying, no, whaling shouldn't be happening.
And then we have a question. Do people tell you that you look like the actor Harvey Keitel? Kettle?
Keitel? I've been told that I look like Alan Thicke. Well, Alan Thicke when he was alive. Harvey Keitel, no. Okay. I think Harvey's pretty cool. If I was as tough as him, I'd be happy, I guess, because he's always playing tough guys.
I think that's our last question, but if anybody has any last minute questions, you can get those in the Q&A. If you're on Facebook, just type them in the comments and Alex will get us those. One question, Robert, what do you find the most interesting, or like, what is one thing that you think is really interesting about whaling?
About whaling, well, I'm certainly fascinated by the fact that there were enough people that were crazy enough to get into these boats and go chase whales to turn them into product. The fact that some of these people couldn't swim. But my time at the Whaling Museum, I certainly become really, really appreciative of whales' processing ability, especially the toothed whales, whose brains are able to take sound waves and create pictures in their brains the way our eyes take light waves and make pictures in our brains. So they're able to see and figure out what's going on in the ocean when they can't see anything, because light penetrates, light doesn't penetrate much past the first 300 or so feet. So I just find whales themselves to be, whales, dolphins, and porpoises to be fascinating animals. And then I'm also impressed with how clever some people are with creating research tools to try to learn about these animals, because they're hard to study. We can't hold our breath. We don't speak whale. We have a hard time being in the water for that long, and whales don't spend much time at the surface. So they're just hard to study, and people have come up with some clever ways to do that. So I'm impressed with that too.
We have speaking of researchers, we have a thank you from New Zealand and whale researchers at the University of, I am not going to say this right, Otago.
Yep. And I'm going to give a shout out to folks in New Zealand at the Te Papa Kongarera Museum. So they've had this huge touring exhibit about whales, dolphins, and porpoises that I saw in Boston in 2010. I was in New York City in 2015. That life-size model of a blue whale heart that's in our lobby was first created in New Zealand by that museum, for that museum, and then we ordered our own from them, that same business down there that worked with that museum, and then it got shipped to us. It got held up in customs because it was labeled whale heart, and I guess somebody thought that this thing that reeked of fiberglass was an actual whale heart, but eventually it made its way to us. So shout out to New Zealand.
And it's going to be the last question.
Okay.
We don't have any more on Facebook or anything, but what of kind of the movies about whaling, what is your favorite, or what is your thoughts on those movies? How accurate are they?
Well, there's silent movie made in 1922 called Down to the Sea in Ships. And back in the early 70s, we took excerpts out of that and worked with a local university and one of our then docents to put a voice to this silent movie. So I mentioned that in 1925, the whaling industry in New Bedford ended.
Mhm.
So in 1922, this movie, part of it was filmed in New Bedford. They then went out with a whale ship and filmed the whale hunt. So you get this black and white footage of an actual Yankee whale hunt because it's in black and white. It's a little bit faster than normal speed, so that part of it's fun to watch too. But you get to see what these guys were doing up until 1925. So that's, I haven't seen the rest of the movie, and I heard the plot's kind of hokey. But there's the movie In the Heart of the Sea. We had higher hopes for that movie. There's parts of it that are totally Hollywood. The 1956 movie Moby Dick, even though they had to rearrange parts of the book, that's pretty entertaining. And I've watched a few documentaries and like archival video footage and almost like promo movies from different countries about their whaling industry. And I always find those interesting to watch.
What about Master and Commander, or some of the they're super recent, not super, but.
Your audience is going to laugh at me. I still haven't seen it.
What?
Even though one of the consultants for that film actually helped build a life-size forecastle or forecastle of a whale ship in our museum, which was up for about 15, 16 years. Actually, a little bit longer than that. Yeah. So someday I will see it. But I've heard it's a really good film.
Well, now that we have a global pandemic, I think this is your time to to see that movie.
So are you giving me permission to watch it on work time and use it as research? Is that it?
I didn't say it.
So I've left my work phone number there and my work email there. If anybody has any follow-up questions, they can certainly send them there. I've only been going into the museums on the museum on Tuesdays and Fridays. So if you call me on a Monday or a Wednesday or Thursday, you might have to wait a day for a response.
And if you comment on Facebook, if you're watching it there, I will get those to Robert. And same thing if you're watching it here and something occurs to you, either way works. So
okay.
Thank you so much for being here. And this was really interesting.
Thank you again for the invitation to do this.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.